There is something Volkswagen rarely says out loud about the Golf Mk6. Underneath the new headlights, sharper bodywork and expensive-looking interior, it wasn't really a completely new Golf at all. When the sixth generation appeared in 2008, Volkswagen did something unusual. Instead of starting again with an entirely new platform, it kept the basic PQ35 architecture of the Golf Mk5 and rebuilt almost everything people could see, hear and touch around it. At first that sounds disappointing, almost like Volkswagen cheated. But the reason behind it tells a much more interesting story, because the Golf Mk6 wasn't created simply to replace an old car. It was created to solve a problem. The Mk5 had been technically excellent. Its sophisticated chassis had transformed the way the Golf drove, the GTI had restored enthusiasm for Volkswagen's most famous performance badge, and the R32 had become one of the most charismatic Golfs ever made. But sophistication came with a price. Building cars is not only about making them good, eventually someone has to calculate how quickly they can be assembled, how complicated each component is to manufacture, and how much profit remains after millions of cars leave the factory. Volkswagen wanted the next Golf to retain the expensive feeling of the Mk5 while becoming more efficient to produce. So instead of throwing away a fundamentally good platform, engineers attacked everything around it. And that makes the Golf Mk6 one of the strangest generations in the entire family tree. Mechanically, it was closely related to its predecessor. Visually, however, Volkswagen wanted people to believe the Golf had matured into something far more expensive. Walter de Silva's design team removed much of the rounded, almost MPV-like softness of the Mk5 and gave the Mk6 a lower, wider and more serious face. The grille became thin. The headlights became sharper. The surfaces were cleaner. Nothing about the design screamed for attention, yet parked beside a Mk5 the difference was immediate. The old car suddenly looked taller and friendlier. The Mk6 looked as if somebody had put the Golf in a tailored German suit. The same transformation happened inside. Volkswagen concentrated heavily on the things owners interacted with every single day: switches, materials, instruments, seats, sound insulation, door seals and the way controls operated. This wasn't engineering designed to impress someone reading a horsepower figure. It was engineering designed to impress someone during the first 30 seconds of a test drive. Close the door and it sounded substantial. Touch the dashboard and it felt more expensive than you expected from a compact hatchback. Drive down a motorway and less noise entered the cabin. Volkswagen understood something incredibly important about mass-market cars: people don't experience manufacturing cost. They experience what the manufacturer allows them to see and feel. The Mk6 became a lesson in perceived quality. Volkswagen was finding ways to build the Golf more efficiently while making the customer feel as though more money had been spent on it. And then the timing became almost surreal. The Golf Mk6 entered the market in the middle of the 2008 global financial crisis. Banks were collapsing, consumer confidence was disappearing and manufacturers around the world were preparing for one of the most uncertain periods the industry had seen in decades. This was hardly the perfect moment to introduce a compact car designed to feel almost premium. Yet that uncertainty may have made the Golf's philosophy even more relevant. Buyers who were nervous about expensive cars could purchase something smaller without feeling as though they had sacrificed refinement. The Golf had always lived between ordinary transportation and something slightly more aspirational, but the Mk6 pushed that position further than ever. Volkswagen began offering technology that only a few years earlier would have sounded more appropriate in a luxury sedan. Adaptive chassis control could alter the behavior of the dampers. Park Assist could help steer the car into a parking space. Automatic high-beam control, dynamic cornering lights, a driver's knee airbag, improved stability systems and increasingly sophisticated infotainment all appeared during this generation. This wasn't technology being introduced into some flagship Volkswagen costing 3 times as much. It was arriving in the Golf. And suddenly the supposedly conservative Mk6 started looking less conservative. It wasn't trying to revolutionize what a hatchback looked like. It was quietly changing what people expected a hatchback to contain. In 2009, the Golf was named World Car of the Year, a remarkable result for a vehicle critics could easily dismiss as an extensively reworked version of the previous generation. That was the contradiction at the center of the Mk6. It was evolutionary by design but surprisingly aggressive in execution. Volkswagen didn't spend its energy reinventing the basic shape of the Golf because it didn't need to. Instead, it focused on refinement, safety, efficiency and technology. And beneath the hood another transformation was accelerating. Small turbocharged TSI petrol engines were becoming increasingly important. Diesel engines were moving toward common rail injection. DSG transmissions were spreading through the range. Start-stop systems and energy recuperation appeared as manufacturers became increasingly obsessed with fuel consumption and emissions. The simple naturally aspirated Golf was slowly being replaced by something much more complicated. On paper, everything looked like progress: smaller engines producing the power once expected from larger ones, faster transmissions, lower consumption and more technology. But complexity always sends a bill eventually. Some of the engines and transmissions associated with this era would later develop reputations enthusiasts and used car buyers learned to fear. And the diesel technology Volkswagen was proudly developing during this period would eventually become connected to a scandal so enormous that it would damage the reputation of one of the world's largest automotive companies. None of that was obvious when the Mk6 first appeared. In 2008, it simply looked like Volkswagen had perfected the sensible Golf. But the most important transformation was still coming from the performance department. For more than 15 years, the ultimate Golf had been defined by one feature no ordinary hot hatch could imitate: a narrow-angle six-cylinder engine. VR6. Then R32. The sound had become part of Volkswagen culture. The Mk5 R32 seemed like the natural formula to continue forever. 6 cylinders, all-wheel drive, Golf body. But when Volkswagen prepared the flagship version of the Mk6, the VR6 disappeared. So did the R32 badge. In its place came a much simpler letter, R, and under its hood were only 4 cylinders. For enthusiasts who had grown up worshipping the sound of the VR6, it looked almost like a downgrade. In reality, Volkswagen was about to reveal exactly where the performance Golf was heading for the next generation, and once that decision was made, the 6-cylinder Golf would never return. The most controversial decision Volkswagen made with the Golf Mk6 wasn't something it added. It was something it removed: 2 cylinders. For years, the fastest Golf had been defined by the VR6. The Mk3 VR6 had introduced the idea, the Mk4 R32 turned it into a cult car, and the Mk5 R32 refined the formula with 250 horsepower, for motion and one of the most recognizable exhaust notes Volkswagen had ever produced. Enthusiasts assumed the next flagship would simply continue the progression, perhaps a stronger VR6, perhaps an R36, perhaps something even more outrageous. Instead, Volkswagen killed the R32 formula completely. When the new Golf R appeared, the 3.2-liter 6-cylinder engine was gone. Under the hood sat a 2.0-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. On paper, it sounded like exactly the kind of change enthusiasts usually hate: smaller engine, fewer cylinders, less drama. But then came the numbers. In European specification, the Mk6 Golf R produced 270 horsepower and 350 Nm, considerably more power and torque than the outgoing R32. With the 6-speed DSG, Volkswagen quoted 0 to 100 km per hour in just 5.5 seconds, while the manual required 5.7. Top speed was electronically limited to 250 km per hour. The new R was not merely more efficient than the VR6 car it replaced. It was significantly faster. And that changed the future of the performance Golf forever. For the first time, Volkswagen demonstrated that the ultimate Golf no longer needed a large engine to feel like the flagship. Turbocharging could provide the power, electronics could help control it, for motion could put it onto the road, and software could determine more and more of the car's personality. The R32 had been emotional because of what happened mechanically. The Golf R was effective because of how intelligently everything worked together. Some enthusiasts never forgave Volkswagen for losing the VR6 soundtrack, but the company had discovered a formula that was almost impossible to argue with objectively. A smaller engine meant less weight over the nose, enormous tuning potential, stronger acceleration, and a platform capable of becoming much faster in the future. Look at every Golf R that came afterward and the importance of this decision becomes obvious. The Mk6 wasn't simply the first Golf to wear the standalone R badge. It established the architecture Volkswagen would continue developing for years: turbocharged 4-cylinder power, all-wheel drive, understated bodywork, and performance that could embarrass cars that looked far more serious. Yet the R wasn't the only Golf showing how rapidly the definition of performance was changing. The normal GTI arrived with 210 horsepower from its 2.0-liter turbo engine, 280 Nm of torque, and something called XDS, an electronic system designed to imitate some of the behavior of a limited-slip differential by selectively braking an inside wheel. That detail seems almost ordinary now, but it represented where the industry was heading. Mechanical solutions were increasingly being supplemented, or replaced, by software. Instead of adding a large, expensive mechanical differential, Volkswagen could use existing braking and stability control hardware to influence how the car behaved through a corner. The Mk6 GTI therefore became an interesting bridge between two eras, still recognizable as an old-school hot hatch, but increasingly dependent on electronics to sharpen the experience. Volkswagen even brought racing driver Hans-Joachim Stuck into the development process for the GTI's chassis setup, a reminder that beneath the conservative bodywork the company still cared deeply about how the car behaved when driven hard. Then came the Edition 35 in 2011. Built to celebrate 35 years of GTI, it increased output to 235 horsepower and 300 Nm. It wasn't some stripped-out track special covered in wings and carbon fiber. It remained recognizably Golf, which was exactly the point. Volkswagen had learned that the GTI's strength wasn't becoming ridiculous. It was making relatively modest changes feel meaningful without destroying the everyday usefulness of the car. But at almost the same moment, another badge was becoming unexpectedly important: GTD. The idea wasn't new. Volkswagen had used the name decades earlier, but in the Mk6 generation the Golf GTD suddenly made enormous sense. Its 2.0-liter common rail diesel produced 170 horsepower and a substantial 350 Nm of torque, exactly the same peak torque figure Volkswagen quoted for the much more powerful Golf R. It wasn't remotely as fast as the R, but on European roads the concept was brilliant. Long range, strong motorway torque, GTI-inspired styling and much lower fuel consumption created a car designed for someone who wanted performance without constantly visiting a fuel station. In 2009 this looked like the perfect European performance compromise. Diesel was being presented across the industry as a sophisticated solution for reducing fuel consumption and CO2 while maintaining real-world drivability. Few buyers could have imagined that several years later, diesel technology inside Volkswagen Group cars would become connected to one of the largest scandals in automotive history. That scandal would explode publicly in 2015, after the Mk6 had already left production, so it would be wrong to define the entire generation by Dieselgate. But looking backward gives the Mk6 a strange historical position. It came from the exact period when Volkswagen was pushing turbocharging, direct injection, downsizing, diesel efficiency and increasingly complex electronic control harder than ever. The advertisements promised that technology could deliver everything at once: more power, lower consumption, lower emissions, and greater refinement. For many owners, it genuinely did. But some of the engineering from this era also showed the other side of complexity. Certain TSI engines developed expensive reputations in the used car world, particularly around timing chain systems on specific versions and markets. Some DSG applications became known for costly problems when maintenance was ignored or components failed. Suddenly the Golf that appeared so beautifully engineered when new could become intimidating once the warranty disappeared. And this is where the Mk6 story becomes far more interesting than simply calling it a facelift Mk5. It represents the moment when the Golf became a genuinely modern machine. Not modern because it had a touchscreen or sharper headlights, but because more and more of its abilities depended on systems the driver couldn't see. Turbochargers extracted impressive performance from small displacement. Direct injection improved efficiency. DSG transmissions used computer-controlled clutches to shift faster than most drivers could manage manually. Electronic systems influenced traction and cornering behavior. Common rail diesels combined huge torque with remarkable economy. The Golf was no longer mechanically simple, and there was no going back. Even the performance hierarchy demonstrated that transformation perfectly. 10 years earlier, 6 cylinders had represented prestige. In the Mk6, 4 turbocharged cylinders could outperform them. A diesel Golf could produce 350 Nm. A GTI could use electronics to improve the way it put power down. The entire definition of what made a sophisticated car was changing underneath a body that looked almost aggressively normal. And maybe that was the Mk6's greatest trick. Volkswagen disguised one of the most important transitions in Golf history as one of its most conservative generations. People looked at it and saw another Golf. Underneath, the old rules were disappearing. The VR6 flagship was dead. Turbocharging was taking over. Electronics were becoming part of performance rather than merely safety. Diesel was reaching the peak of its European popularity. And the Golf was slowly transforming from a machine defined by hardware into one increasingly defined by the way hardware and software worked together. The Mk6 never needed to look revolutionary, because the revolution was happening where almost nobody could see it. And that is probably why the Volkswagen Golf Mk6 is so easy to underestimate. It never looked like a revolution. It never tried to shock people. It arrived looking familiar, almost deliberately conservative, and quietly changed the direction of the Golf underneath. The VR6 era ended. Turbocharging became the future. The standalone Golf R was born. Electronics became part of performance, not just safety, and the Golf moved further away from mechanical simplicity toward the highly sophisticated machine we know today. Some of that progress brought incredible performance and efficiency. Some of it brought complexity and problems that owners would discover years later. But that's exactly what makes the Mk6 important. It sits right on the border between two eras of Volkswagen. Behind it was the world of naturally aspirated engines, VR6 sound and relatively simple hardware. Ahead of it was downsizing, DSG, software, turbocharged Golf RS and increasingly digital cars. The Mk6 wasn't the Golf that changed everything overnight. It was the Golf where everything quietly began to change. And perhaps that's the perfect legacy for a car that always looked much more ordinary than it really was.